It's good to see everyone out this morning. Appreciate our visitors. We're glad you've come our way. Appreciate the reading by Peyton. He did a good job of emphasizing, of course, what happens as you age. The song that Quinn led, I knew it by the title of Never Grow Old. It's in the chorus, but I can never get through that song without a tear in the eye and thinking about what heaven will be like. We'll never grow old. Every once in a while, I get a request for a sermon. And so this is answering a request. Will it be a cheerful one? No, not so much cheerful. But to ask the question or answer the question, well, what happens when we die? That's what we're going to talk about. The passage that Peyton brought to us talks about what happens in this life as we age. You know, the light becomes dim, our eyes are not as good as they used to be. The old grinders are low, even some of us have fewer than others. Hearing, get up early in the mornings. You know, we understand when you're afraid of heights. Roller coaster rides are the thing of the past for me. That's history. But it does happen as you get older. There are things that just naturally happen. So when we think about death, I want us to consider, first of all, a couple of things, the two kinds of death. First of all, let's talk about the physical for a little bit. In Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, very familiar text to us, it's appointed unto men once to die, and then the judgment. So we can't escape that is the point. Now, there are some exceptions. There are three exceptions that the Bible talks about. Enoch, who was taken up back in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 24. That guy never had to taste death. He was just taken. Then you had Elijah over in 2 Kings chapter 2 and in verse 11. He was just taken. Well, who are the others? Well, if you'll just quickly turn over to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, I'll read this quickly. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul talking about and dealing with people who have passed on, he did say in verse 15, "For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep," those who have died. Well, what are you saying, Paul? Well, there will be people who will be alive when Jesus comes back. I don't know if he comes back in our lifetime, then we will not have tasted death the way everybody else has. But if time continues on, all of us here will face death. So there are some exceptions to that. But let's just talk a little bit about what happens at death. Well, obviously, when we read in James chapter 2 and in verse 26, first of all, it makes it abundantly clear that what happens at death is there's a separation. Death, by definition, is separation. This is why when we go to a funeral, we're saddened. Our loved ones, we're no longer with them anymore. We are separated from them, and it saddens us, of course. He says in verse 26, "Whereas the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." So it's making the connection there that you and I need our spirit to live. As you see me in each one of us here, I can look at you and I say, well, you have your body and you have your spirit. But if I died right now in front of you, that would be traumatic to the little ones especially. But the point is, if it happened, you could come up and say, well, his spirit is gone. Body's there. Spirit's gone. They are needed. And that's the only place, if we look at a couple of passages here that make reference to that, back in Ecclesiastes, we'll go back there quickly, Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And in verse, we just had it read, and we talk about this separation that we're talking about there. And then I want to quickly go back to the third chapter, make a connection with what Peyton read. So I'm just going to have the third chapter of Ecclesiastes open. But I'm over here, and what Peyton just read as a reminder. He said, then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. So again, making a distinction between the two. And if we go over to the 3rd chapter, he makes reference in verse 20 of chapter 3. He comes out and he says, and all go to one place, and all are from the dust, and all will return to dust, as we have just made reference to. We've been created by it, of course. The body returned to. Back in Genesis chapter 3 and in verse 19, how God had created man. But I'll go back there and notice not only how that man was created, but again, we're talking about the physical death that will come upon us. And there's some interesting things that we need to bring out in our study this morning. So if you'll just bear with me for a little while this morning. But over in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, he mentions in verse 19, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So again, he's making that point and bringing it out of the body and the spirit and the distinction between the two. Well, what I want us to be aware of in our study today, because when we talk about what happens at death, where do we go? We have a lot of people who like to preach that you go right to heaven. My loved ones are in heaven right now. No, that's not the case. Well, where are they is the question. Well, what I want to establish is the fact that they are somewhere. They are somewhere. How do I know they're somewhere? Well, because John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29, key passages to underscore, by the way. I'm not going to go deal off with some false doctrine that is out there, but some of the false doctrines that teach about certain things can be exposed by this particular text. So it's a good passage to keep in mind. It says in verse 28, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming, in which all who are in the graves will hear his voice, and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. So, well, they're in the grave. Well, yes and no. Literally in the grave, there are times when people are not in a grave, so to speak. You think about what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. All those that are going to be raised, think about what happened during the flood. Everybody, okay? It talks about the fact that everybody goes somewhere. And all the deaths that have transpired since the beginning of time, all those people, and trust me, there was a lot. You start going through the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, and all the numbering that's going on there. It just boggles your mind when he was and that was just dealing with Israel. You think of all the people that have ever existed. They go somewhere is the point. But what we're trying to determine, well, Chuck, where is that? Where is that they're going to come from? Well, before I get there, I want to tell you this much. You're going there. If you are not alive when Jesus comes back, if you perish, I just want you to know that you have a spirit, soul, and you have this body, and they're going to be separated at one time. But where is it actually going? And I want you to know that it is somewhere, and we're going to identify that somewhere as we go through our study. Over in Acts, the 2nd chapter, and in verse 27, we find on the day of Pentecost, the people there were preached about Jesus. We want to tell people about Jesus. And if I preach about Jesus today, I'm going to be talking about what happens when we die. Why? Because Jesus died. We learn a little bit about him, learn a little bit about us. Okay? And so he tells us in verse 27, because you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption, talking about Jesus. When he perished, Jesus goes to Hades. As a matter of fact, what did we study last week? Remember we talked about the thieves on the cross? And we talked about that. And remember our lesson last week, which provoked the question, of course, because the thief on the cross was told, well, Robert read it was the very next verse that he didn't read, which is okay. But he was leading up to it. He didn't know what I was going to preach on. But Here is, the thief says, today will you remember, or he says, remember me in your kingdom, is what the thief asked Jesus. And then Jesus turns to him and he says, today you'll be with me in paradise. Today you'll be with me in paradise. So, where's that? Well, we have to go to Luke chapter 16. In Luke chapter 16, and this is interesting because I was asked, I won't identify the individual, but I get a text that says, Chuck, is this a true story? Or is this just a parable? You know, parables are just stories that, you know, are things that people can relate to. A farmer goes and sows seed in the field. Oh, I can understand that. A man has 2 sons. Well, I can understand that. One thing that we learn about parables, folks, as you go through the scriptures, parables are always based on truths. Jesus never said, well, there was this weird-looking alien came down. Well, no, he's doing things that people could relate to and understand and know to be true. And why do I say that? Because what we're going to read over here in Luke chapter 16, I have studied with people, and they've said, well, Chuck, this is just a parable. Well, I disagree with that, but even if you consider it to be a parable, you can't deny the truths that are being taught within the parable. Think of any parable that you can imagine. You know, here's a lady who loses a coin. Well, boy, that's hard to imagine. No, it's not hard to imagine. You can imagine a lady losing a coin, you know. Or somebody, you know, has a bunch of sheep and loses one, you know. I can picture that, you know. So those things are true. And so when we look at this, and we say, well, Chuck, it's just a parable. Well, let's learn some facts. First of all, when it comes to a parable, Jesus never used proper names. You know, when he talked about a parable, he said, a man had 2 sons. And you and I might sit there and go, well, what was his name? Doesn't matter. It's a parable, okay? Well, Jesus says there's going to be 2 men. Well, what was their names? Well, one of them was named Lazarus. Let's read it. We're going to pick it up in verse 19. I'm not going to read all of it because answering our question, we only have to deal with the first part. So it's in verse 19, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. That's all we need to look at right now. If you want to know a little bit more of what happens, we're talking, you know, about after death. Please read more. I'll make reference to it a little bit later. But here, what do we find? We have 2 people perishing. They died. What happened? Well, we're noticing here that they went somewhere. Well, they're in the grave. Well, no. I know the body and the spirit were separated because they're in spirit realm. They're in spirit realm. And they're in Hades. And now, what we need to learn from this is the fact that they hadn't lost their identity. You will not lose your identity. You know, when you perish, when I perish, okay, if I'm in a grave, nobody's going to come and see it, you know. And over time, grass will grow over. You know, the point is, I'll be forgotten. That's gone. And in time, people forget me. Unless they type my name on the internet, that lasts forever. But the point is that here it is. You're gone. You're forgotten. But I'm going to tell you something. That spirit that you have, that identity, it's never going away. How do I know that? Well, look how much time has passed since Abraham. Go back to Genesis, right? You go back to the 13th chapter. I mean, here it is, this poor man, he's found, Lazarus, he's in Abraham's bosom. Abraham's still around? Huh. Man, he died a long time ago. Well, yeah, spirit, he had spirit too. Every one of us. He was man, and he was separated. That body and spirit was separated. And so he's in Abraham's bosom. Now he's in Hades, right? Well, wait a second. I thought it said the rich man was in Hades. Well, he was in Hades also, but he was in the place of torment. Now, this is why we read the passage in Acts chapter 2. Because in Acts chapter 2, it said Jesus' soul was not left in Hades. Wow, was he in that place of torment? Really? Do we think that? In Luke 23, Here he is telling the thief on the cross, today you're going to be with me in paradise. Would you consider paradise a place of pain and torture and suffering? No, he wasn't suffering. He's over there where Abraham and Lazarus is, in this Hadean realm, as we would use that word Hadean realm. But I'm wanting us to see that Jesus went to Hades. The rich man was identified in Hades. Didn't actually come out and say that the poor man, Lazarus, was, but it just says that they both died. And we find that Lazarus is, there he is in Abraham's bosom. A place of comfort and peace that he actually, if you go on and read more in this story, you learn about this, because obviously there's this gulf fixed between the two, as he mentions, because the rich man is wanting Lazarus to dip his finger in water and come across and cool his tongue, for he's tormented in this flame. I just want us to see that there is a physical death that you have. That's all I'm establishing. But well, where do you go? Well, that's what we're learning right now. When a person leaves this world, we understand that your identity is not lost. You have that spirit that will go on. Now, let's talk a little bit about the spiritual death. So we know that the physical death does exist. Now, obviously there's going to be some overlap here that we're going to talk about. But there's a physical death and there's spiritual death. So we know that over in Genesis, now if we go back to Genesis chapter 2, look what our Lord comes right out and says in verse 17. He says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now the skeptics of the Bible say, that's a lie. They ate the fruit and they lived for a long, long, long time. Well, he wasn't talking about physical death, because he says, the day you eat of it, you will die. Well, why is that? Because what is death? Death is a separation. Death is a separation. Isaiah 59, verse 1 and 2 says, sin separates us from God. Sin separates us from God. So you can be spiritually dead, is what he's talking about here. Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, for the wages of sin is what? Death. You say, well, Chuck, I've sinned. I'm still alive. I'm still kicking. Well, yeah, I know you're still alive. But you know what? You can be alive and still sin. And the fact that you've sinned, well, then you died. You say, well, really? Is that really what happens? Well, that's exactly right. Turn with me to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5. Now this is a point we all need to be thinking about, because you know what? We're all going to die. We already established that point. And if I went up to you and I said, how are you feeling? You say, Peyton, how are you feeling? I'm feeling pretty good. Maybe you should go see a doctor. I'm not going to go see a doctor. I feel pretty good, right? You know, he's like, if I don't feel good, I'll go see a doctor, right? You feel good. Is it possible that somebody could be physically sick and not know it? Think about that. Is it possible? Well, we know that's possible. You could be physically sick and not know it. And a lot of us say, look, I don't want to go to the doctor. I don't even want to know. I don't want to know. I'll just avoid that. Well, the same thing happens here. Because he makes reference to here in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 6, he says, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And you can compare that over to Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1. Those brethren are told there that you have a name that's alive, but you're dead. You can be alive, folks, spiritually, physically, alive physically, but dead spiritually. Now, a person might say, well, I don't feel that I'm dead spiritually. Just like a person who could have, it's funny, we hear about family and friends that, well, I actually had my uncle. My uncle, the other day, he was upset because a friend of his that he just spends all kinds of time with, and he was golfing with him. He lives up in Canada. My mom told me this story just a couple weeks ago, where my uncle was devastated because his friend, they go out and eat, their conversation, nobody's hurting, anything like this. Then all of a sudden he got to the point where he kind of had a sore throat. A week later, he was dead. Cancer had gone all through him, but he didn't even realize it. He didn't not even realize it. And that can happen, we know it. And like I told Deb, I said, I think I'm probably a walking time bomb. I always joke with her when I say, man, it hurts. She said, what is it? I think it's cancer. I don't want to make light of that, but I'm always, hypochondriac. But the point is that we could be. I don't want to make light of cancer, but I'm just saying we could have something and not even know it. And we accept that. Well, spiritually. The fact of the matter is that we know that there are times when people think that they are well when they are not. And of course, what do we find? Over in Ephesians chapter 2. Let's go over there quickly. Ephesians chapter 2. Here's what he says, which is, it's vital for us to understand this, because he says, and you, he's writing to the Christians at Ephesus, and describes their past state. So he says to them, and you he made alive who were dead in trespasses and sins. And once you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom we also once conducted ourselves in the lust of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath just as others. A person says, so what? I engaged in all that. I walked according to the course of this world, but you guess what? I feel fine. Yes, you're thinking physically. You need to understand that there are two kinds of deaths in this world. He talks about a physical death and a spiritual death. Now, the spiritual death, how are you going to know that? How are you going to know if you're spiritually sick? Because he says here in verse 1 of chapter 2, he says, though you are dead, you have been made alive. Now, I'm going to tell you something. A family member of mine, let's say, when I became a Christian, many years ago. None of my family could care less about God or what the Bible has to say. Let me tell you something. When I came up out of the waters of baptism, what happened? I was dead and now I'm alive. Prior to going down into the waters, I was a dead person. I came up alive. Now, when I went home and saw my family, what did they see? What did they see? Did they see me before I left home that day? Did they look at me as a dead person? They didn't look at me as a dead person. They said, oh, Chuck's going to church services. Okay, see you later. Okay, And when I come back, when I came back, what did they look at? I said, wow, that guy's alive. Now, they're going to see that. Now, they might see some changes over time, right? Things that I used to do that I don't do anymore. But what I'm trying to get us to see, folks, is that we need to know whether we are alive or whether we are dead. And the only way, it is not based upon a feeling. There are times where Debbie has told me, oh, you need to let a doctor take a look at that. Something might be there. I get that. And there are times when people say, well, I don't want to go. Why do you want to go? Well, you're afraid of what you might hear. And one of the reasons why people don't want to study is they're afraid of what they might find out. But I'm going to tell you this much. These things are certain. Okay? We've grown up with the saying, two things are certain. Death and taxes. Okay? That's what they say. But I'm going to tell you something. We know physical death is going to happen unless our Lord comes back. The spiritual death happens to every one of us because Romans chapter 3 verse 23 says, we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. All you that are not children, little kids, you all were dead. We were all dead spiritually. Every one of us. So it's not like we can look down on somebody that's not right with the Lord and say, man, look at that person. They think they're alive, but they're really dead. Well, you were too. But you had to be made alive is the point. So there's no room for any of us to look down on other people. And that gets back to what Robert was talking about around the Lord's table. Here it is. Jesus comes and he dies for everybody. Now, there's a part of this that we need to spend time looking at, which the Bible makes reference to a second death that I want to talk about in a moment. But let's summarize 4 things that we've already talked about today. 4 facts that we need to remember that we've already said a few times. You can be dead physically, but you can die in the Lord. All right, now what am I talking about there? Well, that's over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Now get this. You can die physically, and we're all going to die. And when we made reference to Luke chapter 16, we were talking about a man that was prepared and a man that was unprepared. But when we talk about the beggar, Lazarus died, Abraham's bosom, understand the principle of this. He was not in Abraham's bosom because he was poor. Had nothing to do with it. The rich man was not lost just because he was rich. That may have played a factor, but it wasn't just because you're rich. People can be rich and be right with the Lord. And so what you have over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is Paul was telling the brethren there, giving them some words of comfort. And we preached on this a couple months ago. But it's all part of what happens when we die. Well, it depends, because there's 4 possibilities that we're looking at here. So he says in verse 13, I do not want you to be ignorant. I'm in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. You need to sleep in Jesus. He's using the term sleep here. He's talking about death. So for all of us here, we need to make sure that when we die, that we are going to die in the Lord. Now, if you don't die in the Lord, what's going to happen? The people that are alive are going to sorrow like those who have no hope. He told them, no, don't be like that. Verse 15, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain to the coming of the Lord by no means precede those who are asleep. Lord himself will descend from heaven with the voice of an archangel and the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together. There's another reference to the fact that people will be alive when Jesus comes back. I don't know when or when that will take place. Okay, so you can be dead physically, but die in the Lord. You can die physically and die in a lost state. Where's that? Well, we read it. We talked about the rich man. The rich man died. It's a perfect contrast to somebody who's faithful and those who are unfaithful. You want to know what happens when you die? What happens when I die? Well, it depends. First of all, we will die, but you either die in the Lord or die in a lost state. The choice is ours, okay? It's left up to you. Nobody's going to force you. This is just the reality of life. Thirdly, you can be alive physically, but lost spiritually. We already established that, right? Just reminding ourselves of these 4 important facts. So a person can say they're alive. We read that in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Here are people that are alive, but they're dead. They're a walking dead person. Now, people outwardly look at them and say, well, that's just kind of silly. Well, that's why we're talking about the Spirit. Because, remember, a person looks at, well, I don't think you have a soul. But there are people who deny such. Well, it's what the Bible teaches. And it's either you accept it or you don't. But if a person doesn't believe in God, if a person doesn't believe in the Word of God, then none of this is going to impress them. But when a person says, you know, what happens when we die, you can say, well, do you want to know from what Hollywood thinks? Or do you want to know what the religious realm says? Or do you really want to know what the Bible teaches about it? That's the key to all of this. What does God say about what happens when I die? Okay? Well, this is what happens when you die physically, and this is what happens when you die spiritually. So you can be alive physically, but lost spiritually. And of course, this is the one we really want to find comfort in today, is that you can be alive physically and be alive spiritually. I hope that describes you right now. You're alive, so I know you don't fall into the first 2. Okay? But I'll tell you this much, I don't want you to be alive and be lost. That's what we discussed. And so a person can have that comfort of knowing that they're walking in the light and having fellowship with God, as 1 John talks about. Now, we've got a couple of minutes left here, just enough time to talk about this. The Bible does talk about a second death. This is one that we need to think about. Because, a person says, that, when I die, that's the end of everything. Let's open up our Bibles. We've got a couple of passages here I want us to notice in the book of Revelation. So we're going to go to the last book, and we're going to be in chapter 20. Chapter 20. First of all, he says in let me back it up. Let's start in verse 12 of Revelation 20. He says, "And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were open, and another book was open, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them." It's a great passage of what we were talking about. "And they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." So what you have is there's going to be a judgment day, okay? Go to Hades, you're going to suffer, you'll be at peace. Once judgment day comes, and you stand before the Lord, if you're unprepared, in other words, obviously, if you're not right with the Lord, it describes it as a second death, the lake of fire that he describes there. Not only that, we're right there, chapter 21, verse 7. "He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, the murderers, the sexual immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. This is the second death." Now, over in Revelation chapter 2, one of the 7 churches that were written letters to, we're looking at the one that was written, what do we have here? In verse 11, he says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death." So, death will come, but the question is, are you ready? Are you ready? Now, we play the game with the kids, right? Ready or not, here I come. You could apply that. The Lord's basically saying, when he comes back, ready or not, I'm coming. And so the choice is ours to be ready, because death is going to come, and we are either going to be right with the Lord or we are not. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? I would hope that you understand, folks, that Jesus came, took on a physical body, had that physical death. Why? So that we could live physically? No. Yeah, he conquered death. Was that the point so you and I could live physically? No, his point was, I'm going to die so you can live spiritually, so you can be alive spiritually. But you have to put to death the old man. You are in control of that death. You understand that? You have to put to death the old man and put on the new man. And if you're not a Christian, we're inviting you today to put on Christ. Put out the old man. And be ready, because we know life is uncertain.